August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m. In an instant that lasted less than a second, the world changed forever. A single bomb, no larger than a car, unleashed the power of 15,000 tons of TNT over the city of Hiroshima. For 80,000 people below, it was the last thing they would ever experience. For the survivors, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. This is their story, told through the eyes of those who lived through the unimaginable. What did it feel like to be directly beneath the first atomic bomb ever used in warfare? How did human beings survive the unsurvivable? These are the voices of Hiroshima, speaking from the heart of the atomic age. The morning before. August 6th began as an ordinary summer morning in Hiroshima. The city was awakening to another day of wartime routine. Rationed meals, early work shifts, and the constant awareness that American bombers might appear at any moment. Akiko Takakura, a 19-year-old bank employee, arrived at work early at the Hiroshima Bank building, just 300 meters from what would become Ground Zero. She was organizing customer files when she noticed something unusual. A brilliant flash outside the window, brighter than the sun itself. Dr. Michihiko Hachiya was at his home, preparing for another day at the Hiroshima Communications Hospital. As the city's leading physician, he had treated countless air raid casualties. Nothing in his medical training had prepared him for what was about to happen. Sadako Sasaki was just 2 years old, playing in her family's home about a mile from the city center. Her mother was hanging laundry on the roof when she noticed 2 American B-29 bombers flying high overhead, an unusual sight since bombing raids typically involved hundreds of aircraft. 13-year-old Sumiteru Taniguchi was delivering mail on his bicycle through the quiet residential streets. As a postal worker, he took pride in completing his routes despite the constant threat of air raids. He had just stopped to rest when he saw something that defied description, a second sun appearing in the morning sky. At exactly 8:15 a.m., the Enola Gay released its payload from an altitude of 31,000 feet. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, fell for 44 seconds before detonating 1,968 feet above the city. In that moment, the temperature at the center of the explosion reached 3,000 degrees Celsius, hotter than the surface of the sun. What happened next challenged every understanding of physics, medicine, and human endurance. The first microsecond, the atomic explosion began with gamma radiation, invisible, instantaneous, and deadly. For those within 500 meters of Ground Zero, death came before their nervous systems could register what was happening. Bodies simply ceased to exist, leaving only shadows burned into concrete and stone. Akiko Takakura, working near a window that faced the explosion, was struck by the initial flash of thermal radiation. In interviews decades later, she described the sensation. "I saw a tremendous flash of light cut across the sky. I thought it might have been the reflection of the sun off the silver body of a passing plane. In the same instant, I was enveloped in flames that seemed to come from all directions." The thermal pulse, lasting only 3 seconds, generated temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Celsius at ground level. Clothing burst into flames, skin charred instantly, glass melted and reformed. But for those who survived these first moments, the worst was yet to come. Dr. Hachiya was approximately 2 kilometers from ground zero when the bomb detonated. His experience illustrates how the atomic explosion affected those beyond the immediate death zone. There was a sudden flash of light, the intensity of which was beyond my power to describe. In the same instant, there was a crushing blow on my head and chest and a ripping pain throughout my body. The light from the atomic explosion was unlike anything previously experienced by human beings. Survivors consistently describe it as brighter than the sun, or like a giant camera flash. Many who looked directly at the explosion were permanently blinded, their retinas seared by radiation they had never encountered before. Following the thermal pulse came the blast wave, a wall of compressed air traveling at over 400 meters per second. Buildings designed to withstand earthquakes crumbled like paper. Reinforced concrete structures, built to last centuries, disintegrated in seconds. Sumateru Taniguchi, the 13-year-old postal worker, was thrown from his bicycle by the blast wave. The thermal radiation had already burned his back so severely that his shirt had fused with his skin. As he lay on the ground, he watched his neighborhood disappear. Houses collapsed one after another. Telephone poles snapped like matchsticks. The world I had known just moments before no longer existed. For those in the direct path of the explosion, time seemed to stop and accelerate simultaneously. The human brain, struggling to process unprecedented sensory input, created distorted perceptions of duration and sequence. Many survivors report experiencing the explosion in slow motion, as if they were observing their own deaths from outside their bodies. The firestorm. Within minutes of the explosion, Hiroshima became a vision of hell on Earth. The thermal pulse had ignited thousands of fires simultaneously. Wooden buildings, paper screens, tatami mats, and clothing all became fuel for an inferno that consumed everything in its path. But this wasn't an ordinary fire. The atomic bomb had created what meteorologists call a firestorm, a self-sustaining conflagration that generates its own weather patterns. Superheated air rose rapidly, creating powerful updrafts that sucked oxygen from ground level. Winds of over 100 kilometers per hour spread the flames in all directions. Akiko Takakura, her body severely burned but still conscious, found herself trapped in the Hiroshima Bank building as fires raged outside. The heat was so intense that metal fixtures became too hot to touch. Glass windows began to soften and warp. She described the experience. The building filled with smoke, and the temperature became unbearable. We could hear people screaming outside, but we couldn't see them through the smoke and flames. Dr. Hachiya, injured but mobile, attempted to make his way to his hospital to treat victims. What he encountered challenged his understanding of human suffering. Victims lay scattered about in grotesque positions. Some walked like ghosts, their clothes hanging in tatters, their skin peeling off in sheets. Many held their arms out in front of them to prevent the burned surfaces from touching their bodies. The firestorm created a meteorological phenomenon unique to atomic explosions, a convection column that rose over 40,000 feet into the atmosphere. This column sucked debris, smoke, and even human remains high into the sky, where they mixed with water vapor to form what survivors called black rain. Sadako Sasaki, the 2-year-old girl, was thrown from her home by the blast wave but survived the initial explosion. Her mother, desperate to escape the approaching fires, ran through streets filled with burning debris while carrying her injured daughter. Years later, Sadako's mother described the landscape. Everything was burning. The streets were full of people with terrible burns, calling for water. We had to step over bodies to get through. It was like walking through hell itself. The black rain began falling approximately 30 minutes after the explosion. This wasn't ordinary precipitation. It was radioactive soot and debris mixed with condensed water vapor. The rain was so dark, it stained everything it touched. For dehydrated survivors, desperate for any liquid, the black rain seemed like salvation. They caught it in their mouths and cupped it in their hands, unknowingly ingesting radiation that would affect them for decades. Sumiteru Taniguchi, despite his severe burns, managed to crawl toward what he hoped was safety. The landscape had become unrecognizable. Streets I had traveled every day were gone. Landmarks had disappeared. Bodies lay everywhere, some moving weakly, others completely still. The smell was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Burned flesh, wood smoke, and something else I couldn't identify. The radiation sickness. For many survivors, escaping the immediate effects of the atomic bomb was only the beginning of their ordeal. In the days and weeks following the explosion, a mysterious illness began affecting those who had been exposed to radiation. The symptoms followed a predictable but terrifying pattern. First came nausea and vomiting, beginning within hours of exposure. Then hair loss, starting about 2 weeks after the explosion. White blood cell counts plummeted, leaving survivors vulnerable to infections that their bodies could no longer fight. Dr. Hachiya, one of the few medical professionals to survive the explosion, documented the progression of radiation sickness with clinical precision. Patients who had seemed to be recovering began deteriorating rapidly. They developed high fevers, bleeding from their gums and nose, and purple spots on their skin. We had no treatment for this condition because we had never encountered it before. Akiko Takakura spent months in a makeshift hospital, her body struggling to heal from both thermal burns and radiation exposure. She described the progression of her symptoms. First, my hair began falling out in clumps. Then my gums started bleeding uncontrollably. I developed a fever that wouldn't break. The doctors didn't know what was happening to us. They had never seen anything like it. The radiation had damaged victims' bone marrow, the tissue responsible for producing blood cells. Without adequate white blood cells, their immune systems collapsed. Without sufficient platelets, they couldn't stop bleeding from minor injuries. Many who had survived the initial explosion died weeks later from infections or internal hemorrhaging. Children were particularly vulnerable to radiation effects. Their rapidly dividing cells were more susceptible to radiation damage, and their smaller bodies had absorbed higher doses relative to their weight. Sadako Sasaki appeared to recover from her initial injuries, but 10 years later, at age 12, she developed leukemia, a direct result of her radiation exposure as a toddler. The psychological effects proved equally devastating. Survivors struggled with what doctors now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, complicated by the unique horror of nuclear warfare. Many reported vivid flashbacks, triggered by bright lights, loud noises, or even airplanes overhead. Sumiteru Taniguchi's burns were so severe that he spent nearly 2 years lying on his stomach, unable to move while his back slowly healed. The radiation had damaged his skin's ability to regenerate normally, creating keloid scars that covered much of his body. He described the healing process. Every day was a struggle between life and death. The pain was constant, but worse was the knowledge that my body had been changed by something I couldn't see or understand. Medical professionals from around the world came to study the effects of atomic radiation on human beings. The survivors became unwilling subjects in humanity's first encounter with nuclear medicine. Their suffering provided crucial data about radiation exposure, but at a cost that no human should ever have to pay. The aftermath and legacy. The immediate death toll from the Hiroshima bombing was approximately 80,000 people. But the atomic bomb continued killing for decades. By 1950, the death toll had risen to over 200,000. Cancer rates among survivors remained elevated throughout their lives. Children exposed to radiation in utero were born with developmental disabilities and increased cancer risks. The survivors, known as Hibakusha, became living witnesses to the atomic age. Many dedicated their lives to sharing their experiences, hoping to prevent nuclear weapons from ever being used again. Their testimonies became crucial historical documents, preserving first-hand accounts of humanity's first encounter with atomic warfare. Akiko Takakura survived her injuries and lived to age 92, spending decades sharing her story with schoolchildren and peace activists. She often said, "I want people to understand that nuclear weapons don't just kill in the moment of explosion. They continue killing for generations. Every person who hears my story becomes responsible for preventing this from happening again." Dr. Hachiya documented his experiences in Hiroshima Diary, one of the most important medical accounts of atomic bomb effects. His detailed observations helped doctors around the world understand radiation sickness and develop treatments for future nuclear accidents. Despite his scientific training, he never lost sight of the human cost. Statistics cannot capture the suffering we witnessed. Each number represents a person with hopes, dreams, and families who mourned their loss. Sadako Sasaki became an international symbol of peace through her story of folding paper cranes while battling leukemia. According to Japanese legend, anyone who folds 1,000 paper cranes will have their wish granted. Sadako folded cranes, hoping to recover from her illness, but died before completing her goal. Children around the world now fold paper cranes in her memory, making her a universal symbol of the innocent victims of nuclear warfare. Sumiteru Taniguchi lived until 2017, spending his final decades as a peace activist. Despite his severe disabilities from radiation-induced cancer, he traveled internationally to share his story. His final public appearance was at age 88, addressing the United Nations. "I have lived 70 years with constant pain from my injuries, but my greatest pain comes from knowing that nuclear weapons still exist. The world must choose between nuclear weapons and human survival." The Hibakusha faced discrimination in post-war Japan. Many employers refused to hire them, fearing they were contagious or that their children might be born with defects. Some survivors concealed their atomic bomb experience to avoid social stigma, carrying their trauma in silence for decades. August 6, 1945, lasted only 24 hours, but its consequences continue to this day. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima demonstrated humanity's capacity for both ultimate destruction and remarkable resilience. In the space of a single second, science and warfare combined to create suffering on an unprecedented scale. But from that suffering emerged a powerful message of peace. The Hibakusha transformed their trauma into a mission of prevention, using their experiences to educate the world about the true costs of nuclear warfare. Their voices carry a weight that no abstract discussion of nuclear policy can match. Today, as global tensions rise and nuclear weapons proliferate, the testimonies of Hiroshima survivors become more relevant than ever. They remind us that behind every discussion of nuclear deterrence and strategic warfare are real human beings who suffer and die in ways that defy imagination. The fireball that consumed Hiroshima in 1945 serves as an eternal warning. In the testimonies of those who survived it, we find both the darkest chapter of human history and our best hope for ensuring it never happens again. Their message is simple but profound. Nuclear weapons and human beings cannot coexist on this planet. The choice, as always, remains ours.